The platform at Coyote Wells was near empty when Adeline Marsh stepped down from the train with her one trunk and her 3 letters from a man she had crossed half a continent to marry, and the man waiting for her was not him. Miss Marsh. The stranger was young, sun-browned, hat in his hands, and plainly uncomfortable in a way that told before he said another word that something was badly wrong. "I'm Rafe Deacon. I work for Mr. Hollis." "Where is Mr. Hollis?" Rafe, his jaw worked a moment before the words came. "He asked me to tell you the wedding's off, ma'am. Said to give you this." He held out an envelope, thin and funnel-looking, and inside it Addie found train fare east, and a single folded note in a hand she recognized from 3 months of letters that had promised her a home, a partnership, a life built on shared labor and mutual respect. The note said none of that now. It said in 11 curt words that Cyrus Hollis had reconsidered and wished her a safe journey home. He had not come himself. He had sent a hired hand to do it, on a public platform, with half the depot watching a woman receive her own humiliation delivered by proxy, like a parcel too troublesome to sign for personally. She thought of the months of correspondence that had brought her here, careful letters describing a modest but respectable ranch, a man who wrote of wanting a partner in life rather than a servant, promises that had seemed on paper at least decent and considered. She had answered every one of them honestly, had told him plainly of her circumstances, her age, her lack of fortune, and he had written back each time that none of it troubled him. She understood now, standing on this platform with her whole future folded into 11 curt words, that decency on paper cost a man nothing at all. Around her the depot had not gone quiet exactly, but its noise had taken on the particular hush of an audience that scents a scene and does not wish to miss it. A drummer pausing over his sample case, 2 women near the freight office exchanging a look that needed no words to carry its meaning. The station master himself finding sudden urgent business with a ledger he could study without appearing to watch. Addie did not cry. She had learned, in 26 years of a life that had asked a great deal of her and given little back, that crying in front of an audience only fed whatever appetite the audience had brought with it. She folded the note with steady hands, tucked it into her reticule, and looked at Rafe Deacon with a composure that seemed to unsettle him more than tears would have. "Thank you for delivering the message, Mr. Deacon. I imagine it wasn't a pleasant errand." "No, ma'am." It wasn't. He looked, if anything, ashamed of himself for having done it at all, though it plainly hadn't been his choosing. "I told him he ought to come tell you himself. He said a hired man's time was cheaper to spend on unpleasant business than a rancher's pride." "Then Mr. Hollis has taught me a great deal about his character in one afternoon that 3 months of letters somehow failed to reveal," Addie said, and there was enough dry iron in it that Rafe Deacon, despite the wretchedness of his errand, nearly smiled. Word travels fast in a small depot town, and by the time Addie had arranged a room at the boarding house, most of Coyote Wells had already heard that the mail-order bride Cyrus Hollis sent for had been turned away signs seen, and the town, as towns will, split into opinions about whose fault it was. Some assumed the worst of her, that she must have been plainer or older or somehow lesser than her letters promised, that a man wouldn't refuse a woman without cause. Mrs. Aldis at the boarding house counter looked her over with open, unkind assessment before agreeing grudgingly to rent her a room, and 2 women at the mercantile did not trouble to lower their voices when they wondered aloud what a woman had done to get sent back before the wedding even happened. Addie held her chin level through every look and every whisper, because she had promised herself somewhere around Ohio that she would not let this journey, however it ended, take her dignity along with her hopes. She had left behind a dying aunt's household and precious little else. The aunt had raised her after her parents were lost to a river flood when Addie was 9, and had taught her in the long hard years since that a woman with no fortune and no family behind her had only 2 things she could truly call her own, her labor and her name, and that surrendering either one to another person's careless handling was a debt not easily repaid. She was not going to hand over the last thing she owned outright, her own good name, to a town's idle gossip, whatever it cost her to hold her head up while they whispered. There were harder days than others. A Sunday came when the minister's wife, meaning kindness but landing cruelty instead, suggested from the pulpit steps that perhaps the Lord's plan for Miss Marsh lay elsewhere entirely, And wasn't it fortunate she'd learned so early that Coyote Wells wasn't her intended home? Addie thanked her with perfect courtesy and cried only once she was safely behind her own boarding house door, briefly, fiercely, before scrubbing her face and going down to supper as though nothing at all had happened. Because she had long ago learned that a woman who let a room see her break rarely got the chance to prove she could also mend. Rafe Deacon found her on the boarding house porch 2 evenings later, turning the return fare over in her hands like it was a puzzle she hadn't solved yet. "You haven't used the ticket," he observed. "I haven't decided if I want to," Addie admitted. "There's little enough waiting for me back east. An aunt's house that isn't mine anymore, a town that watched me leave it as a woman with nothing to lose and would only watch me return the same." She looked up at him, and something in her plain honesty seemed to cost her, though she offered it anyway. "I don't suppose you know of work in this town, Mr. Deccan. Sewing, cooking, anything a stranger without prospects might do to earn her keep while she decides what comes next." He did know, as it happened. The schoolhouse needed a hand with the younger children 2 afternoons a week, and the widow Calder up the road had been wanting help with her mending, and over the following fortnight, Rafe Deacon made it something of a quiet occupation of his own to see that Adeline Marsh did not go without work, or without a friendly face when the town's whispers grew loudest. He had not expected, when Cyrus Hollis handed him that envelope and told him to see the business done quiet and quick, that he would end up spending every spare hour he had finding reasons to walk past the boarding house porch. He had not expected to find himself waiting, with an eagerness he was slow to admit even to himself, for the particular dry humor with which Addie Marsh met every fresh indignity the town offered her. She did not flinch from hard work, did not complain of her circumstances, did not once ask him to fix what wasn't his to fix. She simply set about building a life out of the wreckage of the one she'd been promised, one mended shirt and one taught lesson at a time, and Rafe found himself, weeks into knowing her, thinking less about the shame of the errand that had brought them together and more about the woman it had, however cruelly, delivered into his path. "You didn't have to keep checking on me," Addie told him one evening, when he'd walked her back from the widow Calder's with a basket of mending balance between them. "I've managed worse than a broken engagement on my own before now." "I don't doubt it," Rafe said. "Doesn't mean a person ought to have to manage it alone. If there's someone willing to stand alongside." He hesitated, then added more honestly than he'd intended, "I've thought a good deal this past fortnight about the difference between the man who sent you that letter and the man who's since gotten to know you a little. I don't think Cyrus Hollis ever troubled himself to learn who he was turning away." "And you have?" "I'm trying to," Rafe said, plain and unadorned, the way he said most things, and Addie found she believed him more completely than she had believed any of Cyrus Hollis's 3 carefully composed letters. She learned, in the weeks that followed, that Rafe Deacon had come to ranch work the hard way himself, orphaned young, raised on other men's spreads doing other men's labor, never quite owning a place of his own to call home, though he'd saved careful and steady toward the day he might. He did not resent Cyrus Hollis's wealth so much as he distrusted what wealth seemed to have done to the man's character, the ease with which money let a person treat other people as inconveniences to be managed rather than souls to be reckoned with. Addie found, listening to him talk plainly of his own hard road, that she trusted him precisely because he had nothing polished to offer her, only the honest accounting of a man who had built what little he had with his own 2 hands and did not pretend otherwise. It was at the church social a month later that Cyrus Hollis, having in the interim taken up with a wealthier rancher's daughter from the next county over, made the mistake of parading his new intended past Addie Marsh in front of the whole gathered town, plainly intending the display as a public correction of his earlier, embarrassing choice. "Miss Marsh," he inclined his head with a condescension so thin it barely qualified as courtesy, "I trust you found other arrangements. I hope there are no hard feelings." "None at all, Mr. Hollis," Addie said, level and unbothered, though the whole social had gone quiet around them, sensing a scene. "I find I've a great deal to thank you for, in fact. You saved me from a lifetime of discovering exactly the sort of man you only after the wedding, rather than before it." A ripple of suppressed laughter went through the gathered crowd, and Cyrus's face darkened. His intended, a pretty young woman in silk who plainly had not been told the full particulars of how her engagement came to be, looked between Addie and Cyrus with a dawning discomfort that suggested she was learning something about her own bargain in real time. A man's entitled to reconsider a poor bargain. A man's entitled to his opinions, Rafe Deacon said, stepping forward before he'd fully decided to, his voice carrying clean across the social hall in a way that turned every head in the building. But you're not entitled to call a good woman a bargain, poor or otherwise, in front of the whole town, Cyrus, and I'll not stand by and hear you do it twice. You work for me, Deacon. Not anymore, I don't. Rafe said it without hesitation, without a flicker of doubt, though it meant giving up the only steady wage he'd had in 3 years. I'll not draw pay from a man who sends a hired hand to do the cowardly work he hasn't the spine to do himself, and then has the nerve to stand in a church hall and call the woman he wronged a poor bargain. I've spent the better part of a month getting to know Adeline Marsh, and I can tell this whole town plainly, since you've made it everyone's business. She is the finest bargain any man in this county will ever be offered, and you were a fool 3 times over to have thrown her back. The hall had gone entirely silent, every eye swinging between Cyrus Hollis's reddening face and Rafe Deacon standing bareheaded and resolute in the middle of the floor, and Addie felt something rise in her chest that she had not let herself feel in a month of quiet endurance. Not just vindication, though there was plenty of that in watching Cyrus flounder for a response and find none, but something warmer and far more startling, the unmistakable, undeniable sensation of being chosen, publicly and without reservation, by a man who had nothing at all to gain from the choosing except her. Rafie, she said when Cyrus had made his stiff, humiliated retreat and the hall's attention had turned back to its punch and cake, you didn't have to do that. You've thrown away your position over a scene that wasn't yours to fight. I disagree. He turned to face her fully, and there in front of half of Coyote Wells, with the doubters and gossips who'd whispered about her for a month now watching in open astonishment, Rafe Deacon knelt on one knee in the middle of the church social floor. I was sent to turn you away once, Addie, on another man's cowardly orders, and it's sat wrong with me every day since. I'd like to spend the rest of my life making up for that errand, if you'll let me. I haven't got Cyrus Hollis's acreage or his bank account. I've got a strong back, an honest wage I intend to build into something better, and a heart that's been entirely yours since about the 2nd week of knowing you, though I was too slow to say so. Marry me, Adeline Marsh. Let the whole town see exactly who was worth choosing all along. The hall that had gossiped about her for a solid month now held its breath entirely for her answer, and Addie Marsh, who had stepped off a train into the worst humiliation of her life and refused, every single day since, to let it define her, found her answer came without a single moment's hesitation. Yes, she said, laughing through sudden tears that were, for the first time in a month, entirely happy ones. Yes, Rafe Deacon, 1,000 times yes. He rose and kissed her there in front of the whole watching town. And the same women who had once murmured about what Addie Marsh must have done to be sent back now applauded and wept and declared, to anyone who'd listen, that they had known all along she was too fine a woman for a coward like Cyrus Hollis, which was not, strictly, the truth of what they'd said a month before, but Addie found, held safe in Rafie's arms with the whole hall ringing with approval, that she no longer had any need at all to hold the town's earlier unkindness against it. They married within the season, in the same small church where he had knelt before her, the pews filled this time not with whisperers but with well-wishers, the minister's wife among them, contrite and generous with her blessing in a way that Addie, gracious in victory as she had been steady in humiliation, accepted without a trace of old bitterness. They built, out of the wreckage of a proxy's cruel errand, precisely the kind of home Cyrus Hollis' careful letters had promised and never once intended to deliver, a partnership of equals, built on a foundation no gossip could shake, because it had been tested, publicly and thoroughly, in front of the very town that once doubted her, and had not been found wanting. Years later, when their own children asked how their parents had come to marry, Addie would tell it plainly, the way she told most things. That a coward had once tried to send her away by another man's hand, and that the hand, as it turned out, had rather more character than the coward, and had chosen in front of the whole town to keep her instead.